y en España en la materia. También, como verán posteriormente, tendremos la posibilidad de dialogar con Bob Agranoff, que a mi juicio es uno de los investigadores más relevantes internacionalmente en lo que se llama gestión pública colaborativa. Y tenemos la suerte de tener con nosotros también al director general de Organización, Régimen Jurídico y Formación, no sé si ese es el orden, del Ayuntamiento de Madrid. Ignacio Molina ha sido un apoyo para nuestro máster desde el comienzo y yo quisiera agradecerle muy sinceramente su apoyo y también su presencia aquí. Una vez que don Ignacio Molina haga su intervención, daré la palabra al profesor Robert Agranoff. Robert Agranoff hará su presentación en inglés para ayudarles a seguirla. Tienen unos handouts, unos materiales y él va a seguir estos materiales más o menos durante su presentación, ¿vale? El resto del seminario ya será en castellano, no se asusten, pero en este primer caso vamos a hacerlo en la lengua original, en la lengua materna de Bob Agranoff, al que luego ya presentaré. Entonces, cuando quieras, Ignacio.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Manuel, por tus amables palabras y agradecer al Instituto Universitario Ortega y Gasset la posibilidad de participar en la inauguración de esta nueva edición del Seminario Permanente. Desde el Ayuntamiento de Madrid, una de las principales estrategias y líneas de actuación del Gobierno presidido por nuestra alcaldesa Manuela Carmena ha sido desde el inicio del mandato la definición de estrategias precisamente de participación ciudadana y de gobierno colaborativo. A tal fin, desde junio del año pasado, en el momento de la definición de la nueva organización municipal, se creó un área de gobierno, el área de participación ciudadana, transparencia y gobierno abierto, precisamente con la finalidad de implementar todas estas estrategias de gobierno colaborativos. Apenas sin transcurrir un año desde el inicio del mandato, ya desde el Ayuntamiento de Madrid se han desarrollado importantes iniciativas y propuestas en el ámbito de la transparencia y del gobierno abierto. Podemos citar entre ellas, por ejemplo, la aprobación de un proyecto de borrador de ordenanza de transparencia que ahora mismo se encuentra en periodo de información pública, o la adopción de acuerdos por parte de la Junta de Gobierno para establecer directrices en relación a los presupuestos participativos o al ejercicio de derecho de propuestas ciudadanas a través de la web municipal. También hemos realizado otra serie de iniciativas en el ámbito de la publicidad, de las agendas de los concejales, de los directivos, de los funcionarios eventuales. En fin, digamos que se trata de uno de los principales ejes de actuación del Gobierno municipal y de esta área, como decía. Contaremos a lo largo del seminario con la participación de Pablo Soto, que creo que interviene esta tarde, que es precisamente el concejal titular de este área de gobierno. En definitiva, con todas estas iniciativas de gobierno abierto, gobierno participativo, transparencia, lo que se pretende es legitimar las instituciones democráticas, potenciar y asentar, fortalecer los gobiernos democráticos, incrementar la confianza de los ciudadanos en las instituciones municipales, en este caso, fortalecer su compromiso cívico, en definitiva, aumentar la calidad y la eficacia de nuestros gobiernos e intentar establecer un marco de colaboración más dinámico y más activo a través del uso de las nuevas tecnologías en el diseño y participación de los ciudadanos, como decía, en el diseño y elaboración de las distintas políticas públicas. Contamos en el seminario con la participación de reputados expertos en el ámbito de la transparencia, del gobierno colaborativo, de la participación ciudadana. Espero que entre todos nos ayuden, nos faciliten nuevas visiones e ideas que permitan perseverar en la consecución de todos estos objetivos y espero que en este sentido pues, el seminario sea todo un éxito. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muy bien, pues vamos a comenzar el seminario. Como ya les hemos indicado, la idea de gobierno colaborativo va un poco más allá de lo que sería las políticas de participación ciudadana y también un poco más acá de las políticas de participación ciudadana. Gobierno colaborativo implica la idea de que la gestión pública hoy en día no se puede hacer solo desde un gobierno, sino que muchas veces necesitamos distintos gobiernos, que necesitamos también el sector privado y que necesitamos el sector no gubernamental. Y la idea de generar redes que entre todos respondan y resuelvan problemas públicos es la idea que hay detrás del gobierno colaborativo. También vamos a ver que la participación ciudadana en la colaboración en la resolución de problemas públicos, que es lo que está después en la mesa redonda trataremos con los laboratorios de innovación ciudadana, donde el Ayuntamiento de Madrid también tiene una labor muy importante. Media Lab Prado es un ejemplo muy interesante de participación ciudadana en la resolución de problemas públicos a través de políticas colaborativas y de programas colaborativos. Por la tarde ya tendremos una mesa específica de participación ciudadana, donde vendrá el concejal Pablo Soto. También tendremos a uno de los más importantes especialistas, que es Tomás Rodríguez Villasante, y creo que finalmente va a venir también el alcalde de Orense, que es el presidente de la Comisión de Modernización y dentro de ella de participación de la Federación Española de Municipios y Provincias. Y luego ya mañana tendremos a Ángel Sanz Carraza, que es el director del Center for Global Economy and Geopolitics de ESADE y que realizó su tesis doctoral precisamente trabajando estos temas en la Universidad de New York y en ESADE, y que nos va a explicar cómo se dirigen redes, cómo se puede gestionar una red, algo verdaderamente interesante y que los que venimos de la administración pública tradicional pues nunca nos habían enseñado. Nos enseñaron a gestionar organizaciones, a dirigir organizaciones, pero redes es algo bastante más complicado y es lo que él ha investigado y está tratando. Y finalmente tendremos un análisis final sobre transformaciones sociales y el papel de las nuevas tecnologías en la gestión pública, sobre todo esto que llamamos Open Government, gobierno abierto. Dicho todo esto, va a tener ahora la intervención el profesor Bob Agranoff, que es profesor emérito de la Indiana University, que da sus clases ha dado sus clases y ha sido director de investigación y de doctorado en la School of Public and Environmental Affairs, SPIA, que es una de las 3 escuelas de administración pública más importantes de Estados Unidos, junto con la John Fitzgerald Kennedy y la Maxwell School of Syracuse, y que, bueno, pues ha dedicado los últimos años a investigar sobre gobierno colaborativo. Anteriormente ha sido uno de los grandes expertos en federalismo y en relaciones intergubernamentales. Una gran parte de los profesores de relaciones intergubernamentales de España se han formado con él. Y es un placer que vuelva al Instituto Universitario Ortega y Gasset, donde ya hace más de 25 años empezó a dar clases en su doctorado y donde ha formado una gran parte del profesorado de las administraciones de las universidades públicas españolas en estas materias de federalismo y relaciones intergubernamentales. Okay, Bob, this is your time. Thank you very much for coming and whenever you want. Les quería decir 2 cosas más. Una, perdón, que tenemos 50 personas más observándonos a través de la red. Tenemos el curso se está dictando también en streaming y también se está grabando para que posteriormente otro grupo de personas lo puedan seguir. Y muy importante que les hemos dado unos materiales, los handouts, para que puedan seguir más fácilmente la intervención del profesor Agranoff. Muchísimas gracias, Bob, whenever you want. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you. I wrote everything that important. There's many important things to say in the world, we know, but I wrote everything that I thought was important in advance because I'm doing it in English, and I thought this way you could carry it with you and so on and continue. And it looks like there's a lot of material here, but some you'll see I'll clear of quite faster than others. Okay. I'm going to talk this morning in terms of collaborative management, public management, particularly focused around 2 things that I'm working on. I'm just about completed and published a book from Georgetown Press about intergovernmental management in the United States, how managers work together across lines in the United States, that I've been working on for most of my professional career. Excuse me. And I'll get to that in a minute. But also, I wrote an article about a year ago or so in a journal about the challenges of multi-level government, different levels of government being involved. And thank you. The administrative challenges. And I thought, fine, okay. And I got a letter from a publisher asking me to turn it into a book, which I never expected to do, but I did. And so these two ideas is what I want to carry with you. The broader ideas is what I want to carry with you. Okay. So, and the pages are numbered in the lower right. Okay. So let's begin. First of all, let me say that lots of things are being thrown around, and I'm going to start where we're going to finish my talk anyway, and that is many colleagues internationally, and in particular in the United States, study networks now. And I think networks are the most important thing in the world, but my position has been networks operate in a sphere of government, and that government may be changing, and networks are important, but government has not been eliminated, is not being eliminated. Many things happen with government. We don't know enough to know how and what. Okay, so that's where I'm going. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is how government agencies are changing versus being eliminated. They're not being eliminated. Okay. So on page 1, what I have here are 3 basic definitions, because people throw around definitions. These are the ones that I use. The first one, as you can see, collaboration comes from Professor McGuire and I in our book on economic development, collaborative management. And it's the idea of working together in different organizations to solve problems, okay, that a single organization can't solve. Secondly, managers who work across these organizations use some kind of synergy or logic to get people to work together in alliances as linkages or networks and other kinds of exchange relationships. Okay, the sociology or the economists would call them. And thirdly, networks are, this is Larry O'Toole's definition. They're interdependence involving multiple different organizations or parts where one is an informal set of the other. Networks are very important today, and so on. Okay, page 2. I started studying intergovernmental many years ago, and when I came to Spain for the first time in 1990, I noticed that the Spanish governments were struggling with working together and so on in the same way, and learned many, many things from some of you in the audience. That great to see you here, that are here. Okay, but today, when we talk about multi-level government, I think we have to talk about more than just the different levels of government. We also have to talk about global impacts. The impact of things such as disability rights or gender rights and human rights. These are all global impacts, as well as the fact that programs are highly intergovernmentalized, education, medicine, and so on. There are many different tiers and levels and so on and so forth. And we have much more involvement of NGOs. In English, we say NGOs, non-governmental organizations are involved. We use contracts, we use shared services, we use partnerships, other kinds of things. Okay, and networking, and I'll talk more about networking as we go on. But networking is important because different kinds of, we've always thought about transportation networks, for example, But we don't always talk about the fact that environment, for example, there's a network that starts with the citizens here and ends up with the national government. Okay. There's two other things that I think are important that we don't give enough attention to, except for those of you that work in government, you probably live this every day. And so I like to talk about them. Let me explain what operational localism is. Whatever national program there is in any country, Spain, United States, when that program gets down to a municipality, Javier, in Valencia, or the municipality of Valencia, or some community, there is what we call operational localism, meaning that the local people put their own little twist on programs. They look at things differently and so on and so forth, and they interpret them differently. You know that. We all know that, and so on. If there's anything I learned from my colleagues here being out in the municipalities of Spain is that people do different things differently in different municipalities. And then there's something that we don't talk about enough, but we should, and that is street level divergence. And that is people who are bureaucrats, police officers on the street, the clerk in the bureaucratic agency. They make decisions and adjustments as well as we go along. All of these things, including operational localism and street level divergence, make a lot of difference and so on. Okay, and we've all had personal experiences with these things, I know. Okay, government doesn't act alone, point 2 there. Collaborative management is, as I said, multi-organizational arrangements. It's asymmetrical. Spain has a lot of asymmetrical arrangements, such as the taxes the Basques pay and so on and so forth. Every country has asymmetrical arrangements. I'm doing a lot of research right now on a program, a federal, state, non-government program that has to do with people who are mentally handicapped. And it has to do with funding in the federal government. And you can get more money if you have more clients out out of the institutions for people who are mentally handicapped from the federal government if you do these things. But not every state is the same. Oregon, one state, has closed all of its institutions and has everybody in the community. Illinois, because of Chicago and the jobs, has closed very few institutions because they don't want to lose the jobs of the public employees that work in and so on. What I'm trying to say here is that there's asymmetries everywhere in the system, and we have to make a difference. Okay. Bureaucracies, and this is part of my theme this morning, is that people who work for bureaucracies are changing, and they're working more and more externally and more this way as well as this way. Okay. Many programs involve multiple issues to approach. And there's a lot of different choices to choose from today. So that we talk a lot about networks and public administration, or in my field, particularly in America and Western Europe. And networks are important of different nonprofit and profit and suppliers and other people and so on. But and so that we do have to deal with networks and so on, and contracting, and things are much more complex than they used to be. Okay, so my point 8 is that government is not going away. Government is changing. It's becoming more relational. Page 3. Part of this comes from sociology. Part of it comes from the idea of by Stuart Clegg, who in 1990 talked about postmodern organizing. Modern organizing being Weber, Max Weber, standard bureaucracy, hierarchy, rules, organization. And he's saying, Clegg is saying many years ago that no, we don't specialize, we kind of de-differentiate. people work in teams. I'm on the right-hand side here, the right-hand side. That boundaries are different, they're broader and so on and so forth. And we network more openly. And what people do, the work of bureaucracy, we have to understand the work of bureaucracy. It's what they do, not what we think they should do. You know, Weber said they should do certain things like make the rules and follow the rules, but that's not really what's important. What's important is being more open and networking and solving problems, problem solving, and understand what people do, okay? And we have to be practical about getting things done, and there's always adaptation of practices from all other cultures. People in my country who work with handicapped people have adapted a lot of their techniques, for example, from things that are done in Scandinavia as a way, and other cultures, other ways of doing things, and so on and so forth. So, and street level bureaucrats, we need to learn from different activities. So that's page 3. Page 4. This is a classic understanding of overlapping. This comes from the late D.L. Wright's book, a very famous book in America and in other countries called Understanding Intergovernmental Relations, How Governments Work Together. And in this, D.L. Wright said that if you look at these 3 models of authority patterns, that while some people like to think on the right-hand side that's inclusive, that everything is within one thing. And that does happen sometimes. And also on the left-hand side, coordinate authority, where separate authority have to coordinate. Wright says we need to think more about, in his book, the middle one, overlapping authority. Authority overlaps. Spain is a good country where there's a lot of overlapping authority among programs and other kinds of things. And the model that I'm trying to get people to think about is not moving towards inclusive authority. Sure, we might like to do that, but it doesn't happen all the time. And some things are exclusively. Driving licenses, for example, in the United States, are only done by the state government, and so on. But there are many things that are done by the streets in the city. It's not just, as you know, the local government, but it's money from the central government, money from the regional government, and so on and so forth. So what Wright tries to get us to understand, and this is the model that's in my head or that I'm working on, is the middle one, where there's overlapping authority. Some people have some authority and others, and you have to work within it. So that's an important model. Okay. Now, page 5. To all of my friends who talk about how important networks are, I have compiled, I'm not going to go over all of these now, but I've compiled a list of 32, I think there are 32 here, different ways that people can collaborate between government and non-government. It's not just networks. It's not just networks and so forth. Some involve just coordination, number one, different kinds of engagement, and so on and so forth. Some involve number 2, minimal engagement, but you regularly have to interact, and so on and so forth. Listservs and so on, as you can see there. Thirdly, number 3, there's intermittent action where people work back and forth some of the time, but not all the time, and so on and so forth. And then fourthly, networks do fall in the 4th category, and that is most networks where there's more interaction, more engagement, and so on. All I'm trying to say with this piece of paper is that I can think of, you could probably think of more, but I can think of 32 different ways that people can collaborate, and they don't have to be in a network necessarily to do it. So that's what I'm saying on page 5. Page 6, contracting, because today we do a lot of contracting outside and so on. of government. Government procures services. Some of you may work or be involved in government contracting. I was in the military many years ago, and I remember that we got shoes, we got shoelaces, we got shirts, uniforms, and those things were contracted out. The military didn't make them themselves, they contracted them out, as you know. Okay, these kinds of contracts have been around for years and years and years. In fact, procurement probably goes back way in terms of history. We even bought defense or soldiers or people to fight for us or other kinds of things. People were contracted to build a fence. Now think about it. I wanted you to think for a minute. Building a fence, if you contract with someone who's a fence builder around your land, may be a little different than, say, the Navy, the Armada, building a ship. Okay, when you build a ship, there's a lot of details, there's a lot of complexity and so on. Think of the range of difference here. And one of the former students that we had years ago at my school, Trevor Brown, the first name at the bottom there, and two of his colleagues, David Van Slyke is at Syracuse University, is that complex contracts are different. And some of you that work in this field know this. It's difficult. It's different because we don't know exactly what the end product is. Brown and his colleagues studied complex contracting with the Coast Guard, with ships, getting ships. And what they found was that ships, they can't be specific. Excuse me, they have to make adjustments as they go along and so on and so forth. So what I've defined here at the top is what's complex contracting is. And that is, we're not sure exactly what the end product is at the end. People who work with handicapped people moving out of institutions into the community are, we don't know exactly what services they're going to need until we get there and we try things, and some things will work better than others and so on and so forth. So all we're saying in that first paragraph is that because of those uncertainties in contracting, we need to be more open about it. That's an important point, because you're exchanging roles. Buyer and seller need to interact more in terms of contracting and so on. And the definition then in the third paragraph is that the buyer and the sellers don't know exactly performance and so on. And the exchange requires investments in assets that lose value if the exchange is executed, so that the exchange is incomplete. Okay, and the payoff is not clear what's going to happen on payoff uncertainty. So formal rules for contracting and so on sometimes make it harder to interact. So what's important, and here's the important point here, key contract-related strategies. Brown and his colleagues say that we need to do more interactive contracting, meeting together, understanding, what is it you want? Can we do this? We can't do this. Yes, we can do it. So that's the idea of relational contract. A relational contract at the bottom is, instead of a more detailed formal contract, it's more general and informal, allowing the buyer and sellers to have an engaged relationship, long-term engaged relationship, and so on and so forth. So, and I just wanted to point out to you that the work of Brown and his colleagues on relational contracting is really important, because I think more and more of the things that we buy in government, or that we need to understand as professors or whatever, involve very complex kinds of things. And we have to understand that it's a process and it's more open and so on and so forth. It's a different kind of transaction than buying an apartment or a house or something like that, sending down, these are the details, signing and so on and so forth. And we in government really work with more detailed contracts as a result. Okay, page 7. Page 7 and 8, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. This is for your own purposes, and that is to show how networks occur. We're moving from contracts now to networks and so on. And what I've taken is employment of handicapped people with a United States focus and how it leads to networks. If you look at the policy goals on the left-hand side, it says ADA goals, Americans for Disability Act goals. If you look at the left-hand side, you can see the goals are opportunity for employment and participation, independent living, and going on to the next page 8, economic self-sufficiency and so on. What I'm trying to point out here is that there are strategies that we have in America or in other countries in terms of employing handicapped people, and they're listed in the second column there. And some of them are federal government programs, the third column over there. You can see work incentive programs, welfare to work grants, work incentives and so on. And then state governments, because these are federal state partnerships, involve all these actions on the right. Grants of awards, outreach. I'm not going to read all of them. What I'm saying is that different people have to do different things. Different parties are involved in different things. Excuse me. And if you turn the page, you can see that if you look at the very right-hand side, you can see all the different kinds of things that have to be done to employ the handicapped, or could be done to employ the handicaps. Now, the source for this, as you can see, comes from many, many, many things involved, including work that I did many, many years ago with one of my doctoral students, Alex Patakos, who's now at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. And basically we said that you've got to do all these things, you've got to link all these programs. If there's no one what I'm saying is that we all know that there's no one program. There's no one sector that's involved, but many programs. That's all I'm trying to point out here. And that leads to the need to network, to set up networks and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, can I make a little side comment? Many, many years ago, in 1980, when I had my job interview, I was at another university. When I had my job interview at Indiana, I gave the presentation of this. And while I was speaking, giving my presentation, everybody was whispering, talking. When it was over with, I said, I know I put I bored you, but what is it that was important? And they said, your presentation told us that we have a new course called Intergovernmental Management, how you manage across the boundaries, vertical and horizontal. And they said, you're going to teach it. That's how I got into it. It was this study right here that got me into it in 1979. The rest is history, the old English saying is. Okay, page 9. Here we're talking about just the idea that when you implement a program, a federal program, the work that I'm doing, on the handicapped involves the different levels of government and the private sector. And all we're trying to say here is that we're involving intergovernmentally, the higher level governments, the regional governments, LGs stand for local governments, NPOs stand for nonprofit organizations, charitable organizations, for example, firms, business firms, and so on. And programs today, it's a diagram, a diagram of what I was just saying, are both public and private programs and so on, and then they go to the final recipient. So here's this person that gets a service here, and it starts way at the central government and goes down, as you know, and so on and so forth. Okay, page 10. We're moving. This is my concept that remember I talked earlier about overlapping models of government? No local government, for example, and I've done I've done quite a bit of work on local government, including some work on local government in Spain at one time. No government stands alone. No local government stands alone. It has the regional government, has a diputación, it has partners outside and so on. So all I'm trying to point out here is that, and some of the work I've done is on economic development, business development, and community development. The idea of making the community a better place, arts, culture, music, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying here is that no government stands alone. In this square in the middle, you have the city council and the mayor in the different departments and neighborhoods and social service and so on. But if you start at the top, 12 o'clock, we use 12 o'clock, as you know. If you look at 12 o'clock, look at all the committees that citizens are involved in the city. And then you go to, we call certain working groups, task forces, working groups. Downtown development, arts and culture, I'm at 1 o'clock now. And then at 2 o'clock, you have the federal government, the central government, federal government on housing and urban development office. And you have the state government at a little after 2 o'clock there, the state grant and loan contracts. And then you have neighborhood planning associations. You have a separate board that deals with parks and recreation. In America, we deal with a lot of separate units of government, and I know in Spain you do too, so, okay. And then there's a separate water and sewer district in many, many, many states in the United States. Water and sewer are a separate unit of government that cuts across many not just the city government, okay. And then there are state regulations and so on. Many communities, I know they do this in Spain as well, if you look at 9 o'clock, have what they call a local community and economic development corporation, a separate unit that deals with community and economic development that's separate from the city government, but is sponsored or related to the city government, and so on and so forth. And so that's another unit of government, and so on and so forth. And then there's, as you see at 11 o'clock, the Metropolitan Planning Agency, and you have all the people on the outside, on the left-hand side there, the realtors, people who deal with realty, merchants, business people, and so on and so forth. All I'm trying to point out here is something that I'm trying to reinforce the idea that we don't work alone, we work with other people on different things. Page 11. I'm trying to make one point here, and that is no project that a city would take on, for example, the city that I just illustrated, it could be this one, Salem, Indiana, okay. The important thing is that no project, almost everything today is very complicated. And you not only have all these other entities with, as you know, any kind of project has all kinds of steps. So what I did here was that I broke down the idea that a city that has an industrial park at the edge of the town, a park for industry, there are at least 11 steps, as you can see here, in expanding its industrial park to put more space, more businesses in there. Starting with the land purchase and improving the land and construction and attracting businesses and dealing with the water issues, dealing with human resources, the people, making, in this case, they wanted a road around the city so the trucks wouldn't go into the center of the city, operating the industrial park, putting housing in there, and developing computer literacy. I just kind of went, as I sat down did my research with Salem, these are the most important things they did. And look at all of the different kinds of actions that are needed for a single project, and look at all the other entities that are involved. Federal, state, city, other local. That's all I'm trying to point out here. Okay, page 12. Okay. What I'm trying to point out is that, in this page, is that we have to think about today what I call 1.0 organizations and 2.0 organizations. A 1.0 organization is a standard bureaucracy. with divisions and hierarchy and legal authority and so on and so forth. What I think I disagree with my colleagues is that they say that those are disappearing and we're getting more open. I don't believe that. I believe that we still have hierarchies and rules and so on and so forth and so forth. We have divisions and departments, but we're also dealing with what I call 2.0 organizations, where we don't have divisions. That people, that's a terrible English term, collaborarchy. I shouldn't have used it, but anyway, flexible organizations where there's a lot of collaboration. Authority, some authority is transferred out from different organizations. And we have people who have epistemic communities, have shared beliefs in the environment, so shared beliefs in improving the culture of a community, and so on and so forth, okay. And we work not only this way with rules and so on over with 1.0, but we work interactively with people, discursively, back and forth and so forth and so forth. Sometimes in sequence, sometimes not. We work across units. That's what I'm trying to get across here. We employ joint strategies. The industrial park that I just went through is a joint strategy. And there's a new term, most of you know this by now, it even has been translated into Spanish. I was reading yesterday, interoperability. When you have different organizations working across boundaries and so on, you have to think about how operations touch one another and so on and so forth. We've actually had that for a long time in business and in manufacturing. People in government only lately have been thinking about the importance of interoperability. In the studies that I do of the handicapped people and moving handicapped in the community, there's nothing more important than the interoperability of this organization to work with this organization, to work with this organization related to a certain client, and so on and so forth. Okay, and we deal with multiple direct points of access, or accountability, and we have to, and this is a real tough term, we could have a whole seminar on legitimacy and accountability. Who's the legitimate actor? How does it work? Who's accountable for what? Interoperability brings on a lot of complexity and so on. Okay, so that's page 12. Moving along here. Okay, page 13. Some of us that studied classical public administration learned about post-corb, planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and budgeting. And what I'm saying in this, and I'm not going to go over it just to introduce to you, that post-corb, these standard bureaucratic procedures are more open and they are changing and so on. So I'll leave that with you. Okay. 14. Obviously, I'm not going to read you a whole page of English. What McGuire and I found in our study of networks is that to manage a network involved 4 basic functions. One is activating, getting the people together. That's the first paragraph. The second paragraph is mobilizing, getting them to move, getting them to do things together. The third thing then is framing. What are we going to do? How are we going to organize it? What are we going to look at? And so forth. And the fourth is synthesizing, and that is synthesizing in the sense of now that we've done it, we're going to analyze it and see how we can do it, how we can do it. Those are the 4 management steps that we found when we were studying these business networks. Okay, but if you turn to page 15, McGuire and I got a second chance. I know this looks awful to you. This is a study of another network we did in Columbus, Ohio, of 16 different school jurisdictions and the Ohio State University and a research institute, Battelle Research, and several. It was a network of about 25 organizations. And we were charged with studying with this network. And you can see the idea was to bring advanced education to young people, STEM education, science, technology education, and management. And the idea was to work to build this advanced school. And it had lots of challenges that I won't get into now. You might think this is where they took the best students and had them even get better, but they weren't. It was just it wasn't all the best students. Anyway, but I'm getting away from this. Okay. What I'm saying is that at the top of this diagram, all the different entities that were involved in the network. I want you to see a real network that we've studied. Okay. And in the lower right, you can see the funding sources, all the different funding sources of the network. And you can see that they relied on, they had a governing structure at the top, 12 o'clock for the Educational Council of the 16 districts and so on, and then a management group below that. And then they had curriculum industry advisory groups, 2 o'clock. Battelle was a major lending source. It's a big research institution in Columbus. And of course, there was the families of the people and the after school activities. I mentioned the funding, not multiple funding sources already. They had a series of learning centers down there at 5 o'clock, including the university and lots of the arts in Columbus and the city government. All those were learning centers and so on. They set up a foundation to organize learning because they wanted to go from this school to the 16 school districts to move it up. Then there was the research team that studied it, which I co-chaired down the left-hand side, and then work with the rest are just schools that they work with and everything else. Now, what McGuire and I tried to do, remember I told you those 4 activities of how networks are managed? What McGuire and I tried to do basically was to go through the sequence of what they did to see whether those 4 stages, activation and so on and so forth, existed. And indeed, we found that they did exist, but we found that also, we found that they don't exactly happen in the sequence that I presented them to you. They happen at different times in different places when needs arise. And that bottom part of the diagram just shows you the sequence of how this network was formed and organized and how it worked and so on. And then we had one of our doctoral students, who's now at the University of Nevada, look at the structure and the operation of the network. And he found that there is a management, and you'll hear more of this tomorrow from Angel Saz Carranza, about there's a structure of management that exists and leadership in a network that occurs. And it's not just chaos, it's just certain things happen and they involve. And what Kopakov, that's the student's name that worked with me, did was looked at how networks are organized. And looking at other networks, Saz Carranza has done the same thing. Okay, so that's page 15. Okay, 2 other things I want to say. Page 17, yeah, and 18. Again, I'm not going to read you a whole page. What I'm saying here is that, I've been saying this all along, the state is not hollowing out. We have people in our field, particularly people like O'Toole and Ken Meyer and Brenton Millward in the United States, that say with contracting, with grants, with other kinds of things, the state doesn't exist. It's hollowed out. It's a shadow itself. Okay. What I'm saying in this piece of paper, and I'll let you read it on your own, is that the state is not hollowing out. The state is changing. Okay. This is my most important message today. And that is the state is not changing, but they're working together with other people, working this way, but they're not eliminated. Government is not going to go away. For those of you who have spent your career either working in or studying government, you will not be out of a job. It will continue, trust me. And that's what I'm saying in this thing from a piece that I wrote on a book on networking. So that gets me to the last page. Okay. Now, how is government changing? Okay, and this is the theme of the government, the book that I'm working on now, the second book I'm working on. Okay, so the first 3 points I've already made. They look they're somewhat the same in form and so on, but they operate relationally, conductively. Okay, and we work in a network world with NGOs, non-governmental organizations. I believe that 8 functions are important in today's bureaucracy or today's government administration. One is that if you are working with external agents, you are usually funding and contracting with them. So point 1 is make sure that you're not being cheated, corrupted, and all this kind of thing. We're looking out for corruption and so on and so forth. We're learning more and more that as things become externalized, that not everything that we think is happening. And the dollar ounce. So looking out, that's an important role for government. I can't emphasize that enough. Okay. Secondly, we can't forget, I haven't said much about politics, but you know, we're in the political world, all the way down the line, political world. And so the second function is that we're doing much more politics and other kinds of things. That's how I got into government. It was through politics myself. Okay. Thirdly, we're more managing relationally, like the contracting, the complex contracting I talked about. There's going to be more of that, more and more of that human relations, working across the boundaries and so on and so forth. Okay. It's not as simple as we've bought 12 oranges, you get 12 oranges. It's much, much more difficult than that. Okay. Fourthly, there's more participation in the network, the interaction of the network. Somebody has to take leadership, and that's one of the things that Saz Carranza talks about is leadership in networks and so on and so forth. Saz Carranza, I was on his doctoral thesis committee. He got his thesis at New York University, and I had the privilege of being on his committee. Okay, fifthly, we're going to do more operational mapping. Remember the one page I gave you about the industrial park in Salem, Indiana, or how the network operated in Ohio. I think we're going to have to do a lot of operational mapping as bureaucrats to find out what's going on, what's the structure, what's the operation, and so on. Sixthly, I think we're going to have to learn more about governance, not government, but governance. If we're working in networks or if we're working in relational contracts or other kinds of things externally, there's a governance process with a small g, you know this, where people have to work. And I think we have to learn to handle that kind of governance as well. Seventh, and this is important, and that is many roles that governments have won't go away. We have to maintain the law. We have to maintain the regulations. We have to maintain guidance for programs and so on and so forth. We have to maintain acquiring finances and getting finances, spending finances, all these things. Reporting, it's not going to go away. I don't think anyway. It's not going to go away. Okay, so forth. All these things that we've always called administration will change, but they'll still exist to a certain degree. We're not going to stop reporting. Okay, it's going to be easier with electronic networking and other kinds of things. Okay, and finally, as I've said earlier, interoperability, learning to work across the boundaries, working with other people whose program intersects with your program, intersects with this program, and so on and so forth. All of these things are important, and that's what we're going to do. And for those of us, and I see many of my colleagues out here who are teaching administration, I can't say that we're going to learn to teach interoperability, but we certainly need to raise the awareness of students about interoperability. So there you have it. Government is not going away. Government is changing. And we need to be aware of changing. Maybe it existed all along, but we weren't thinking this way. Maybe the German sociologist Max Weber led us down the bad path. I don't know. Anyway, but people, I learned this many, many years ago, and part of it, to me, was that I started in politics and then got involved in government. Some of you did. And politics teaches you to learn about crossing boundaries and going back and forth and interacting with people. And I think this is what we have to do. Thank you.
Todavía tenemos 3 minutos para algunas preguntas para el profesor Agranoff. ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿Alguien se anima? Se puede hacer en castellano y se la traducimos también. Okay.
I haven't answered everything. It's a lot of English to follow for some of you, I know. So.
I have one.
Okay.
My question is, how can we improve accountability within networks? Because, it's very difficult to be everybody accountable there.
I think that's a good question. I think for one thing is that I think it has to be, I'll say 2 things. One is I think it has to be built into the process, not after the fact. What did we do? How is it accountable? But it has to be built in the process. How are we going to be sure this is going to happen? So that's one quick way of saying it, that it has to be a part of the normal process. The other thing is we have to realize that to a certain degree, we have to respect professional accountability, that people who do certain things do them for professional reasons and so on and so forth. And the other thing is that we have more tools for accountability with electronic record keeping and social networking and all these kinds of things, create more opportunities for doing this kind of thing. But I think that what you're raising is an important point, and that is that it has to be a conscious part. These people that worked in this network in Columbus, they had the ultimate accountability was the students, passing and this kind of thing, and of the contracts and so on and so forth. But they spent a lot of time, the management structure, looking to make sure that everything was accountable and so on and so forth. But your suggestion is that it doesn't happen very often, and you're absolutely right. It doesn't happen very often in networks. Who else would like to?
¿Una otra pregunta?
Shy in English? Ask it in Spanish and I'll do my best. It's a lot of material.
Okay.
Short period.
Finally, one thing, public procurement. Nosotros en la contratación en España, como sabéis, tenemos algunos problemas de corrupción, pequeños. Entonces, la cuestión, nosotros siempre tenemos el peligro de la interacción con el contratista, ¿no? Sin embargo, Bob nos dice que tenemos que interactuar con el contratista para que nos dé solución a problemas complejos. La pregunta es cómo hacer una interacción que no acabe en special relations, relaciones especiales, ¿no? Bob, my question was that in public procurement, for complex process and for complex services, you said that it's important to have a relationship with the contractor that is open and you go back and forth and all that. But here in Spain, we are afraid that this could end in corruption. How can you avoid this problem?
Good question. A year ago, I would have said, well, you have a special problem. Of course, we know that's not the case. Corruption is a problem everywhere. I think that corruption how can I put it? Corruption is more of a problem with all these externalization things than we think. Even in countries where there's not a lot of corruption. For example, let me give you the example because I was just reading about it. And that is, in America, there's this program of employing handicapped people. And there's a special contract program that the federal government has for states to contract what they call protected classes, women, minorities, blacks, Hispanics, handicapped people, and giving them contracts. And we believed, and this was to encourage them to get involved in government business. And it turns out that there's more corruption in the program than we ever thought. And by that I mean is that this particular one program, a number of the contracts, and this is what I think you'd call corruption, they'd have somebody who was handicapped or a minority sign the contract, but then the work was done by other people anyway, and they passed it on and so on and so forth. And not only that, and this is hard for me, I'm a native of Minnesota in the north of the United States. And we always thought of ourselves as being honest, good government, so on and so forth. Very strong Scandinavian and German political tradition in Minnesota. And Minnesota was found out to be cheating on the minority contracts, that they were giving contracts to people who are not minorities, who are not protected class in the law, and so on and so forth. And I think we have to come to, I don't have a good answer for you, but I think we have to come to grips with the idea that this exists further down the line than we did, than we assumed as we go down the line. And that's just one program that exists. The state of Oregon was sued a few years ago by the federal government because when they closed their institutions that I mentioned earlier, that most of the handicapped people that they were supposed to get jobs, they weren't real jobs. They were putting 3 bolts or 3 screws or 3 nails in a plastic bag that went into some manufacturing thing. They weren't real jobs. So I think that this is a big problem with the corruption. And it's also why I tried to point out that we have to, part of the problem is that maybe, I hate to say this, but I will, maybe we're too idealistic. We have to realize that we have to come to grips with the fact that we're dealing with people and we're dealing with the real world. And when you get down to a village in Valencia, for example, or other places, people who are at the street level are doing things that we, in a program that we don't think they should be doing or they aren't be doing, but they do them all the time, and so on and so forth. So, and this is what we call street level bureaucracy. For those of you that do a lot of reading or academics, I suggest you read an article by an Israeli political scientist his name is Anat Goffen, G-O-F-E-N, and the title of the article is Mind the Gap. If you've ever been on the subway in London, you know, you have to be careful so you don't fall where there's the space. And he's saying that in public service, there's that kind of street level corruption where the social worker or the license bureau person and so on and so forth makes adjustments and so on to the program and so on and so forth. And so I think that's important to realize. Every one of us in this room, unless you're really good, has the experience of a street level bureaucrat doing something differently. And I think we have, and that moves up. And then communities take programs and do things differently. Contractors take programs and do things differently. It's a real hard problem as a result of that. But we don't have control systems like manufacturing. Anyway, I think I better stop talking about that.
Thank you very much. Bueno, pues acabamos con esto. Como veis, no solo tenemos problemas con los cursos de formación en España, también en Estados Unidos los tienen. Y bueno, volvemos dentro de media hora. Muchísimas gracias.
Now, if you want to hear a good story during the break about my experience with street level bureaucracy, I'd love to tell it, but I won't tell it to the group.
Ok. Tomamos un café y volvemos. Gracias.